Thank you, Ray. That was pretty much everything I wanted to cover. You've done it. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's literally our summer today, and you've chosen to be here, so that means a lot, however misjudged it might be. The title of my talk is quite long and ridiculous, so I've created a handy acronym for you all to remember it by. We actually have Dave Harland. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dave. He's also known as the word man to thank for the title. It's not actually my work. We have worked with Dave on and off for 3-4 years. He's one of our lead copywriters. And as this is being videoed and he would know if I hadn't said thank you and acknowledged him, I figured I would do so. This is my 4th TMM talk. So the first 2 talks I did were part of the online series that Joe Glover runs. The first one was based on one of our books, Delusions of Grandeur, and actually there's a little bit of crossover, partly because I'm lazy and partly because it's still true to talk about a lot of the delusions that exist in marketing. The second one is something that I feel really, really passionate about as an industry, and I think marketing there's many ills in our industry, and I think a lot of them can be traced back to how we value creativity and how we literally trade creativity. The billable hour, which is the norm for most agencies to adopt, I think is a big problem, and I don't think it's the right way to exclusively charge. So they are available. I've said that people didn't hate them instead of liked. That's a little nod to something we're going to talk about a bit further on. A quick starter, can you raise your hands if you have a hand? It always helps if people actually realise they were. You're not raising your hand. You haven't got any hands. Can you raise your hand if you work for a big global brand that a random nan off the street would have heard of, like an Apple or a Microsoft or a Nike or...
Is it freelancer or is it brilliant?
Well, I hadn't anticipated that. Half up. Because the reason I ask is, and this is something that we feel quite strongly about, and Elliot, who's one of my colleagues, sat on the sofa over there. If you work for a big known brand like that, I think you are, not always, but mostly doing marketing in easy mode. If you work for a big brand like an Apple or a Nike, the chances are that business has a very mature marketing function. The chances are they get marketing, they understand marketing, and the chances are you don't have to spend your life marketing internally and justifying what it is marketing does. The other reason is because if there's any 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝗶 Institute fans or geeks like me in the house, you will be familiar with what's known as double jeopardy, which is 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝗶's conclusion that if you work for a big known brand, you not only benefit from having larger market share, you actually enjoy a greater level of customer loyalty. So actually, the people in this room, I believe, have to work even harder and have to find those marginal gains where success lies. So I think a lot of what we're going to touch on now is really, really relevant, even if it might at times sound quite trivial and obvious. The other thing is those big brands don't get asked to do this. This is my second favourite metaphor after arguing with idiots is like playing chess with pigeons. Have you heard that? No matter how well you play, the pigeon will shit all over the board and strut around like it won anyway. Welcome to my Twitter. You don't get asked to paint the fence when the house is on fire, and that's like silly little trivial things like, can you work on a newsletter, or my nephew thinks we should be on TikTok even if you sell stair lifts and it's not appropriate to your demographic. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, marketing internally and justifying what we do. Marketing is a serious business function and it needs to exist, and it needs to demand more respect than perhaps it does. But instead of pointing fingers, I genuinely believe marketers, everybody in this room, the entire industry, needs to be and take responsibility for making sure we get that seat back in the boardroom. I don't think it's enough to point fingers and blame. I think that's the opposite of what we really should be doing. And we don't make it easy for ourselves. So as marketers, we should know how to choose or create a segment of people and target our communications to those people. So if you're talking to your finance director, don't talk about brand awareness, talk about future sales. Brand awareness is a good enough proxy for future sales. If you talk about sales to a CEO or a finance man, you're more likely to get taken seriously. The 3 core points that I hope I leave you with today, if the talk is successful, is number 1, think long. You are probably no doubt already aware that there are two types of customers. If we can crudely chop them in half, or not even half, the ratios will change. There are current customers and there are future customers. Most marketing effects happen over a significant period of time, depending on the sector. So think long. Mark Ritson talks about bothism, making sure you're covering short-term and long-term objectives. So think long. Be distinct. If we accept that marketing does happen over this timeline, we need to make sure that when a buyer is ready to buy and actively ready and looking for a product or a supplier, that we come to mind. And being distinct is a relative measure. Nothing is distinct on its own. If you go, I've got lots of family in Australia, so I can say this. If, as one of our colleagues does that sadly couldn't be here tonight, she has a wonderful mullet, when she walks around Reading, she is distinct. In Sydney, she wouldn't be distinct because relative to what else is there, there is an alarming amount of mullets, and she wouldn't be distinct. But when you're looking at being distinct, look at your category, look at your competitors, and then understand where to play. And thirdly, target wide. So where your budget allows, think about that future buyer, think about who's going to be buying next month, next year, whatever it might be, and think about how can I become known to those people. This is an increasingly popular set of statistics to share. LinkedIn's B2B Institute, I think it was in partnership with 𝗺𝗵𝗶𝗶, I think it was a guy called John Dawes, created what he calls the 95-5 rule. Which I find a bit strange because it's definitely not a rule, it's more an observation that people aren't always in the market. So if we use this example here on the end and we accept that people will buy cars once every 10 years, then that's a relatively tiny 10% of people are actually ever actively looking to buy a car in that whole year. So when you're talking about what you're doing and how you're trying to achieve success in the market and trying to marketing internally, make sure people's expectations of ROI have that figure in mind and think about how can I affect those future buyers when they do enter the category. This is all the context that we're working in. And the funny thing is I found, so Gasp is 15 years old. I think I've just realised we missed the intro slide because all the things, but it's all right, you nailed it. Gasp is 15 years old, and so we're at that age where we won't pick the phone up unless you text us first, a kind of spotty teenager age. But what I've noticed since running the business is that there used to be an understanding of marketers of historic evidence and all this wonderful empirical data and creatives from yesteryear, say, the likes of 𝗺𝗺𝗲𝗵, who built his career on breaking category norms. There's people like Dave Trott who talks about impact, communication, persuasion. If you don't have impact, then whatever you try and communicate, whenever you try and persuade, it's not going to register because you haven't caught their attention. We used to, I think, know this far wider than we kind of do these days. The 𝗺𝗵𝗶𝗶 Institute have built their whole institute on those two founding principles of mental and physical availability, which again, if we nod at the kind of semantics that we use in marketing, sounds a little bit ambiguous. And it wasn't until I interviewed Colin Lewis, who's a really, really talented marketing guy, one of the guys behind the 𝗁𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗁 characters. He said, oh, you mean make it easy to think of and buy stuff? And that's what mental availability is. It's just making it easy for someone to think of you when they come into a buying situation. And buying stuff is the physical availability. So we're not going to touch on physical availability, but that's literally getting a product in the hand of the consumer. Doesn't mean it's a physical shop or a physical purchase. It could be an e-commerce site, for example, but it's the physical actually obtaining the product. And I think we've been distracted for 15 years. This is a guy called Bob Hoffman. He goes by Ad Contrarian. He has a great blog. He's now not, partly because he's now retired, or he claims he's retired, but he's as big a loudmouth as he ever was. He kind of talks unfiltered about the industry, and he's really, really good at being able to freely point out some of the ills that do exist. I really luckily have got to know Bob really well over the last few years, and last year I got to hang out with Bob for a couple of days in Sydney, and I saw him talk. And with his blessing, in fact, with his encouragement, excuse me while I read this out, I'm going to quote him from a talk that he gave all across APAC last year. We have gone through what was expected to be one of the most fruitful and productive in the history of marketing and advertising. We have amazing new tools, new technology, and amazing new media that we never had before. The whole thing was intoxicating and certain to lead to all kinds of new opportunities. Our ability to personalise advertising and reach consumers one-to-one would make advertising more relevant, more timely, and more likeable. Our ability to listen to consumers' conversations through social media and react quickly couldn't help but connect brands more closely with their customers. The opportunity for people to interact with media was certain to make advertising more engaging, yet by the almost unanimous opinion of people inside and outside the business, the standard has gotten worse. Rather than creating advertising that's more relevant, timely, and likeable, we're creating advertising that's more annoying, more disliked, and more avoided. Ipsos data reveals that regard for our industry has been hovering at new lows. Recent studies suggest that compared to 20 years ago, twice as many people say they find advertising annoying. Twice as many people. As a result, some type of ad blocking app is present on somewhere between 1 and 2 billion devices worldwide. It's absolutely ridiculous what's happened, not solely because of ad tech, but as a result of the type of changes we've seen as digital and social media and everything has entered the world. This is one of the most overused quotes in any marketing talk, this lovely quote by 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗶, but it's one of the most quoted and overly used, certainly in, I suppose, my circles of marketing events, for a good reason. Tactics and tools change, as Ray mentioned in the intro to me, but we really need to look at what doesn't change. Man evolves at such a slow rate, people evolve at such a slow rate that it's barely noticeable. And this is the key thing. So before we do anything, before we reach for Google, before we start searching, your mind has already made the decision of what you're going to search for. John Lombardo, when he was at the LinkedIn B2B Institute, said, "Today marketers invest billions of dollars in search engine optimization. We want our brands..." Sorry, that's come off now. "We want our brands to come to mind easily when buyers enter the market. We've got the right objectives, but we're optimizing the wrong search engine. The right search engine is the one in your head." And as we've established earlier, we're not in the privileged minority who can simply outspend and make sure our logo and our products get in the face of the people we wanted to get in front of. Jenny Romanek talks about how advertising is geared towards persuasion rather than building mental availability. So rather than actually coming to mind in a particular situation, persuasion is about assuming you're in the room and you're arguing your point, whereas mental availability is about getting into the room. So we need to look at how we can increase our chances of getting into the room. Again, Coca-Cola knew this. In 1915, their brief to develop a distinct bottle wanted the bottle to be so distinct you could recognise it by feel in the dark or lying broken on the ground. And I think they obviously succeeded, and it's been helped, obviously, by over 100 years of consistency. But again, this was known, and I feel like we've almost not forgotten it. And of course, there's wonderful practitioners and marketers who know all of this remains true. But we need to understand how information is stored in the brain, how we receive information, and then how we recall it by cues. So as a quick show of hands, does anyone know who was the 44th president of the USA? One. Okay. Does anyone know who was the first African-American president of the USA? Okay, so same answer, yeah. It's the same answer, okay, but the way the brain receives information is based on cues. The brain reaches for that cue. When I asked you this, your brain was thinking 44 and president, and it didn't come up with an answer. It's the same answer, but that is the way we kind of store and file and then retrieve information. So how information is stored, how it is recalled is significant. This book by 𝗿𝗵𝗶𝗶, Decoded, is based around the science of why we buy. It's a really fascinating book. And I've interviewed Phil previously, and I highly recommend you buy the book. But he looks at how consumers behave, how they respond to stimuli, and essentially what makes them buy. And the terminology that comes up time and time again in lots of shopping behavioural books and content is cognitive misers. Humans are cognitive misers, which means they're lazy. Their brain is very, very lazy. And when we buy, we're looking for good enough decisions. So we use brands as heuristics, as mental shortcuts to buy. So the more familiar something is, the more likely we are to buy it. I crossed out the liked and put didn't hate earlier. 𝗺𝗵𝗶𝗍, who's also a leading practitioner, certainly very vocal about his work in behavioural science, and certainly someone else you should follow, talks about how consumers mostly satisfy, they don't maximise. When we satisfy, we choose and prioritise least likely to be shit over most likely to be great, because our brain needs easy decisions. And if it didn't, McDonald's would never be your choice in Rome airport when there's a local cafe, because you're trying to minimise the chances of something being bad. So brands and familiarity, which builds trusts, actually allows consumers to make quick decisions which aren't as taxing on the brain. These two brain scans, which I've lifted from Phil's book, show literally what happens when the same person is presented with a favoured brand that they're familiar with and one they're not familiar with. And actually the difference in brain activity is quite significant. And this stat on the previous page, I've seen this quoted widely, mostly by these guys. I can't find the source of that stat. Everyone seems to be quite willing to share it, but no one's really reinforced the source of the data. So take that with a pinch of salt. But assuming they mean I'm going to put my left foot forward now, then my right foot forward, then perhaps there's some truth to it. But even if there isn't, it's only natural that consumers and life, and all of us in general, who have much more important things in our life to be doing than choosing a brand in a supermarket, are looking to minimise that cognitive load. One of the things that we can use to our advantage comes back to homogeneous stimuli, hence why that's there. We live in a world of conformity, whether it's movie posters or car ads. There's a tendency to follow the herd. Mark Ells talks about herd mentality, and there is safety in being part of a herd, but in a commercial sense, it's commercial suicide. For a brand to follow the herd and look like their competitors is commercial suicide. And again, looking at how the brain works, this is quite a crude example, but in its simplest form, there's over 25 sheep in this image, but your brain will remember two. It will remember the black one and the white one. And so when we're exposed to different visual assets or experiencing something or reading something, it's crucial to bear that in mind. We have a German professor called Professor von Estorff to thank for this finding, and it comes back to that homogeneous stimuli. But her work, which she did in the early 20th century, showed that when you are exposed to a selection of stimuli, the one that differs the most from the competitive set has a much greater chance of recall. So all else being equal, each of those words should have the same percentage chance of being recalled. But actually what they find that if you don't belong in the competitive set, you are significantly more likely to be recalled. And yet you look at any or a lot of industries, I think it's fair to say the biggest culprit maybe in recent times, less so now with the rise of Monzo and more kind of banking companies with a lot more personality and vibrancy. You look at B2B professional services, so many look and sound the same, they use the same language. A better example, and you won't find a brief that comes into or out of Gasp, my agency, that doesn't say, how can we make client X be more party cannon? Party Cannon is a Scottish death metal band, and they seem to understand the power of being distinct more than a lot of marketers. And it's commercially significant. So again, Harvard Business Review published some Bain & Co research which showed that 80 to 90% of people have a mental shortlist in mind when they're looking to buy a product. So if I was going to say to you, I'm going to say air conditioning, that would be a good one to test, or business insurance, or trainers, or ice cream, the chances are in your head you probably have between 3 and maybe 7, 8 brands that naturally come to mind, depending on the category. the research shows that 90% of people ultimately buy from that set. So if my maths is correct, that's between 72 and 81% of the overall market will only buy from brands that are already known to them. It comes back to Phil Barden's shopper research, brands which are known, brands which are familiar. So yes, by all means, when the people who are ready to buy identify themselves and they send signals which might lead to, say, a PPC ad, don't stop trying to win that fight. But actually the bigger pond of customers is the ones of the customers who aren't yet ready to buy. We need to be known by these people. And this is evident not only visually. This is something from BBH Labs a few years ago, and they noticed at one given time there were over 27, or at least 27 brands using the same advertising strapline of find your whatever. It doesn't make any sense. Find your Belfast, find your more, find your greatness. It just all blends in. So when you're mentally trying to retrieve that data, it's all muddled. There's nothing distinct to draw on. Nowadays, it's probably redefine or reimagine. It seems to be the kind of go-to lazy advertising slogan. Pick the sector and stick reimagine behind it and run the ad. It's just bizarre. But there's other ways to stand out and other ways to be remembered, to taking advantage of being distinct. So 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗶 hotels are one of my favourite examples. They are a budget hotel based in Amsterdam. Now, most budget hotels spend their money trying to convince people they're not a budget hotel, and they try and kind of make their rooms look nicer and look more appealing. 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗶 own the fact that they're a budget hotel, and they're so proud to advertise that you get a bed in every room. Or free Wi-Fi available with the neighbour's password. Like, they're so distinct. The category norm is so mundane and so dull that they've doubled down. Now, you could easily argue that there's use of humour there. There's something called the pratfall effect, which is, sharing your weakness or flaunting your weaknesses. But whatever it is, it's distinct versus the category norm and has led to significant success from a marketing perspective. I could give you so many examples, but I'm mindful, how much time I have available. So I chose to stick with the same category, the hotel category. There's a hotel called the Magic Castle in Los Angeles that some of you might have been familiar with. They are on TripAdvisor. They are classified as the second best hotel in Los Angeles. I've never been, but they're not the second best hotel in LA. They have, I think, twice as many excellent or very good reviews than the Four Seasons, I think, in Beverly Hills, which is a luxury hotel, which is just bizarre. Not least because their hotel rooms are basic, their swimming pool is the size of a bathtub, the whole place looks tired. But the standout distinct moment is this popsicle hotline, which I've rather foolishly cropped out the old-fashioned red phone that would otherwise be here. You can pick that phone up at any time of the day, and one of the staff will appear with white gloves and a silver platter of ice lollies for you to choose at your will. And it's that dedication to one really distinct, admittedly ridiculous moment where they've managed to achieve so much success and become so popular. It's literally just ice lollies, which must be cheap, right? From an F&B perspective, it must be one of your cheapest purchases. So my recommendation is to look at whether it's your company or your client's companies, and look at every interaction that can and might happen and think about how can we dial up and be distinct. Someone was telling me earlier about when you phone up typically a services company and you're put on hold and you get the same message read back to you that there's unprecedented numbers of calls again and the same old music, and it's really mundane. And there's a company that has just started donating a small amount of money for every second that you're on hold. So for every minute you're on hold, we'll dedicate 10p to charity X. And immediately they've reframed it and they've done something so distinct that you don't feel so frustrated being on hold, because by being on hold, you're benefiting someone who needs who needs assistance. So look at everything and don't just think, it has to be our logo. It can be absolutely anything. And it doesn't have to be everything. It can be one thing that is just so distinct. And if you do that, as going back to Jenny's quote that I read earlier, you'll be in the room. You'll be part of that consideration set, that mental shortlist that people naturally think of when they look to buy a product. And then you can try and persuade them with your rational reasoning. That's absolutely fine. But make sure you're part of that set. So just to touch on those 3 points, again, talk about future sales, don't talk about brand awareness. Think long, think about how you can influence buyers who are yet to actually be actively looking to buy. Be distinct, be more party canon relative to the competitive set. So have a look at what the industry looks like. Have a look at your competitors. We used to do an exercise with clients where we would, and this is not done to embarrass clients, but we would take language from their website and language from competitor websites, strip them of any brand codes, and just print the words black Arial text on white paper and stick it up around the room and ask them to identify their own and ask them if they could identify any of their customers. Think about how you can stand out and be distinct. And it's amazing how many of them say the same thing. And target wide. Success will lie in influencing future buyers. That's not always going to be affordable, especially if your activity and you're judged per month, per quarter, whatever it might be. You need to pick the fruit as well as water the tree. I totally get that. But actually have these conversations internally about why it's significant to invest in the future, because that's where success will lie. Think bothism. And that's it. Thank you.